Hey guys, so I got my MCAT scores back in the beginning of this month, and it turned out that I scored in the 100th percentile. If you're wondering, I got a 524, and since then I've had a lot of friends ask me what I did and how I got there, and I love to answer people's questions and help people out because I was on the same struggle bus. But I did find that I was repeating myself, saying a lot of the similar things to a whole bunch of different people, so I just figured it would be more efficient for me to make a video, put it out on YouTube, not just for my friends, but maybe if someone else were to find it helpful, then, I'm happy to provide my input, especially because I myself found a lot of advice from the online community, and some advice was helpful, some wasn't, and hopefully I'll be able to give a new perspective on the MCAT. So here it goes. In this video, I would like to talk about my personal timeline, my calendar, and the materials that I used. So with that said, my actual intensive prep was only for about a month, but I don't know if that's accurate to say because technically my prep started freshman year. I definitely say that I didn't necessarily work hard, but I worked smart, which I think is key to being successful in the MCAT. So whenever I took classes my freshman year, I wasn't sort of explicitly preparing for the MCAT. I always saw it as my classes as an MCAT prep course in a way. For example, if I was even in like general chemistry, I thought of that as, okay, this class is going to help me on the MCAT, so let me pay attention for that. So before I would have a test in the class, I would reference the Princeton Review MCAT books and just try to see what the MCAT would cover in relation to what I'm about to test on. And I always found that the classes were actually a lot more in-depth than what the MCAT would cover. However, the MCAT obviously has more breadth. There's not a single class out there where you can study biology, chemistry, physics, sociology, psychology, and like logic and reasoning all in one course. So obviously the MCAT has more breadth. But I did find it useful in a way to sort of cross-reference things from, it just reinforced my knowledge if I cross-reference things from what was being taught in class with the Princeton Review MCAT books. But in terms of my more explicit MCAT prep, I was planning on taking the MCAT in the January of my junior year. So that would have been the semester after I took biochem. So during the summertime after my sophomore year, I had just gotten back from studying abroad, and at that point I had some time between the study abroad session and the fall semester starting. So during that time I kind of did some internet research and found some practice questions, and I had the Kaplan prep books at that point. And so I would kind of go through those books a little bit and just familiarize myself with the tests and the questions. And at this point I was still trying to figure out what was working for me in terms of studying effectively. And at that point I was doing practice questions and sort of light reading. And the reason why I say light was because I tried to read those books almost cover to cover. Like I tried to read through the whole chapter and highlight. I tried taking notes, but that was way too slow. But I even tried to just read through the chapters and highlight, and it was just taking forever, and it just wasn't efficient. And so that's what I'm saying about working smart versus working hard. And by the end of the summer I was nowhere near ready for the MCAT obviously, but also I wasn't planning on taking it until January. So that fall, I took the Princeton Review Ultimate MCAT course. That's sort of the 123-hour class that the Princeton Review offers. And also I did 21 hours of coursework, including biochem, as I mentioned earlier. So I had a lot on my plate at that point, and I didn't actually have time to do the sort of hefty amounts of homework that the Princeton Review provided because I was already taking 21 hours. But with that said, I didn't even show up to all of my Princeton lectures. I showed up to most of them, I guess, and even at the lectures, like, I wasn't even 100% there 100% of the time when I was actually in the class. So the class was on top of my like 21 hours of coursework. That class took up 3 hours on every Friday, Saturday, and Monday. Plus the sociology, the online sociology and psychology section took up 3 hours on Sundays, and that was for 6 weeks. And while I was in the class, I did try to be active. So I would participate actively. I would try to respond to the instructor's questions as much as I could. And I had the books, the Princeton books, open in front of me. And as the instructor was lecturing and writing things on the board, I would try to find what he was talking about in the actual books and like try to highlight whatever was matching what he was saying or taking notes in the margins. And I would just say that this, like taking a prep course like Princeton or Kaplan, I wouldn't say that's actually required to do well on the MCAT. That is something that I did, but I think it is important to keep your content background strong so you can focus on finding test patterns. And that's kind of how I really spent that 1 month when I was intensively preparing for the MCAT, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. But yeah, I think it's fine if you don't necessarily invest in those courses because, like I said, it is about working smart, not hard. And I think if you put in all this time into the course, you'll be able to cover everything in the course that the MCAT covers. But the fact is that from your classes, you should already have kind of a background on chemistry, biology, organic chemistry, whatever, because you have already taken those classes, even if you didn't do what I did by like cross-referencing the MCAT books. The Princeton classes, I would say, were useful for providing some structure in delivering the content, and because they provided the AAMC resources for free, with the exception of the flashcards. I took the class throughout my fall semester, and my plan to be ready for January was to sort of use that winter break to essentially live and breathe the MCAT. And I definitely recommend taking the MCAT after a long break, whether it's winter break or summer vacation. Definitely capitalize on that time where you don't have school or anything like that to sort of interfere. In that sense, I would say even like school would kind of be a distraction. Now, I was planning on testing in January, but it actually didn't work out because my family was moving and I was helping them with the move, and it was like this huge transition phase, and it was kind of a distraction. And so not too long before the deadline, before I could push it back, I did decide to push my exam back to March. And at that point, I would say it was a good idea for me to actually aim for January in the beginning, so that way I had a margin to be able to retake the MCAT if I needed to, or to push it back. Now, definitely the MCAT is something that you want to try to get it right the first time. So retaking it would have been kind of last resort. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to try to give yourself a margin to do that. So if you're especially if you're trying not to take a gap year or anything like that. So when I pushed it back to March, at that point I was kind of like, okay, I really can't push this back much further. I don't have much of a margin left. If I do push it back and I still want to apply this cycle, then I would have had to start the application without knowing my scores, because I had sort of, in my mind at least, like just this one chance to take the exam and get it right. I made the MCAT my #1 priority. And so that spring semester, I took exclusively business classes. I do have a business minor. I study neuroscience, but I have minors in business and Spanish. So I changed all of my classes to be just business classes, just to lighten the workload from all the heavy hitting science classes. And that January and February, I would still say I wasn't really thriving in my MCAT prep. So I was going over my weak concepts and things like that, and I'll touch more on how I did that in a different video. But I would look at the quick sheets at the gym or something like that, like the Kaplan quick sheets. And while I'd be at the gym, I'd listen to the Khan Academy, like especially the psychology and sociology stuff on double speed. If I was like in the car or at the gym. And I tried using third-party practice exams too. I wanted to save my AAMC materials for closer to the actual test date so that at that point I could really get used to those materials. But honestly, I wasn't really seeing a lot of progress. My scores had kind of plateaued, and I kind of felt like it was hopeless for me to keep trying because I would still try to do the content review and things like that, but it was just not working out. But I guess I just hadn't found my method yet. Now, by the time March rolled around, I only had a few weeks left, and that was kind of an intense time for me to actually crack down and concentrate, and I just needed to find sort of an isolated place to be able to do that. So I needed, like I said, I recommended testing after kind of a substantial break, but you know, with March, I didn't really have a lot going on besides spring break. So basically, I stopped going to my classes. Now, I'm not saying don't go to your classes, study for your MCAT, but that was just in my experience, that was something that I could have afforded to do. I had a TA job and I also got excused from that, and I actually showed up for an exam the day before my MCAT for a class, but otherwise I really just kind of pulled away from my classes. But at the same time, I did have a strong cushion because I knew that I would have to take the MCAT, so like from the beginning of the semester, I was working on all that extra credit and just building a nice cushion for myself so that during the few weeks before the MCAT, if I did need to sort of pull away from everything, then I had kind of a safe margin to do that and still make all A's. So about the 3 weeks before the MCAT, at that point I was literally doing nothing besides the MCAT. No gym, no dance. I danced bachata, although I did have a bachata performance exactly 3 weeks before my MCAT, but after that performance, like, I wasn't doing anything. When it was time for me to actually study in that intense sort of 3 to 4 week period, I would do nothing besides the MCAT. And I would wake up at 8 a.m. and I'm not a morning person. If you just leave me there on the weekends and just on my own with no obligations, I will definitely be sleeping in. But for the MCAT, I would wake up at about 8, and then I would do a practice exam for 8 hours. And at that point, during that intense period, I was only using the AAMC materials. And so I did a practice exam, or if I couldn't, because the AAMC is kind of stingy about their resources, I kind of made my own practice exams in a way where I made it to have 50 to 60 questions and kind of made myself have 4 sections. I'll go over that a little bit more in detail in a different video, but I would basically do a practice exam one day, and then the next day I would spend 10 to 15 hours reviewing that exam. Now, it just depends from person to person how long you might take to review an exam, and like I said, I will make a separate video detailing exactly how I reviewed the exam, but yeah, that was just kind of how I did it. And by the end of every day, whether I was doing a practice exam or whether it was a review day, my brain was fried, and I think it was a good idea for me to sort of sit down and recharge at the end of the day, and I would generally do that by watching a TV show, like a funny TV show or a funny movie, and then the next day just wake up and do it all over again. I didn't follow this calendar exactly to the T, but it does give a good idea of pretty much everything that I did. So as you can see, most of the things that I did here are all AAMC materials. So here, this is all AAMC stuff. And it was very hard for me to kind of see if I was actually doing well consistently because I jumped from the equivalent of a 509, and I use an online converter to get the 509 because of these things on the AAMC. Unless you take the 3 actual practice exams that are scored, you don't get a numerical score, you only get a percentage. So basically I use an online calculator to convert that percentage to the equivalent of a score, and I was getting numbers like these. And I did throw some next step exams in there as well, and a Princeton exam towards that last month because I was running out of the AAMC materials. Now, as you can see, the last sort of few things that I did were the sample or the practice exams from the AAMC. Now, for the most part, I tried to do the equivalent of a full practice exam, and I tried to do them under timed conditions. So as you can see here, in the beginning, I don't really do that so much. But here in the beginning, I did a question pack, one half physics and half of a chemistry question pack. And that was basically the equivalent of 2 sections of Chem Phys and then 0 sections of the rest of the MCAT. And then I did the official guide, and that's basically the equivalent of a half section of each of the 4 sections of the MCAT. And then here for this one, it's 4 sections, but it's 0 psych-soc sections, but 2 of the bio-biochem sections. So the point was more so to build stamina than to build the content background at this point, especially because, like I said, most of the content we should already kind of have an idea of. When it comes to preparing for the MCAT, it's really just fine tuning. But yeah, when I started to get into these actual practice exams, then that was a full practice exam with the content and everything. And then I gave gaps to review. And so at first I tried to do it so that it was, well, here I was still on break, but going into here, I tried to do it so that it was the weekends. Here, this is another weekend. And then towards the end of my prep, it's basically every day. And this calendar is not exact by any means, and I did like maybe 1 or 2 more Princeton exams on my own that I didn't put in this calendar. Also, another thing that I did that I didn't put in this calendar was the AAMC flashcards. They don't typically come with like a Princeton class or a Kaplan class, but my friend let me borrow them separately, so I did go through every single one of those questions. So this is a broad overview of what I did and the materials that I used to pull my questions from. And the whole time that I was doing the review days, I was using the Kaplan books as a reference rather than reading it cover to cover. So that's kind of what I did in terms of my timeline and the materials that I used. Definitely your number one resource in terms of materials that you can use is the AAMC materials. Even if you don't take a prep class and you won't be getting those materials for free, if you're gonna pay for anything in preparing for the MCAT, definitely pay for those materials because the AAMC is already pretty stingy about how many resources they put out there. So I highly, highly recommend capitalizing on what they do put out for the rest of the world to see. Thank you so much for watching this video. And if you found it helpful, let me know in the comments, and also shoot me questions in the comments as well. I do plan on filming a Q&A video, so I will be happy to answer any of your questions. And I do plan on this being sort of a series of videos, so maybe you can give me ideas on other videos that I can make. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you give it a thumbs up.